Ready your scythes and prep your plague-infused bolt rounds, as it looks like Death Guard have got significantly better in Warhammer 40k, and their new contagions are looking very scary indeed. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Death Guard, and in this video I thought we'd talk through 6 of their most improved units that are looking seriously quite scary in game right now. Death Guard were one of the armies that was struggling most in Warhammer 40k prior to the balance update and points data slate. Win rates are around about 36%, and just one of the weakest factions in the game with all sorts of bad things going on. Fairly slow and fairly low damage, which is kind of normal for them, but also not really all that tough for the points either. Very limited index synergy, and perhaps arguably one of the worst combinations of detachment and faction special rules. The biggest staples in competitive lists tended to be things like Deathshroud Terminators and Plague Burst Crawlers. At least power-wise in the datasheet, the Death Guard are probably one of the biggest winners out of any of them though, very much appropriately as being lower than most of the other bottom factions in 40k. They did get huge points cuts throughout the index, which will definitely help out a whole bunch of units, although admittedly there is the downside of Death Guard feeling a bit weirdly hoardy now, and not particularly elite for Nurgle's finest. Perhaps equally meaningful though are the new contagions of Nurgle. The new detachment rule adds on a whole section where it buffs the spread the sickness, and pre-game you get to choose between 3 additional buffs that can layer on with the -1 toughness of the standard contagions, either reducing enemy ballistic skill and weapon skill by 1, worsening enemy saving throws by 1, or debuffing with a -1 to leadership and objective control. I feel like in general one of the first two is probably going to be the way to go. I'm not sure that Death Guard are one of the armies that can really get away with just playing objectives, and need to use this for a bit of raw might, either extra durability with the -1 to hit thing, or chewing through particularly tough armor saves with the rattle joint one. I feel like the -1 to hit might be one of the ways to go if you're fighting against enemies that are either close range or melee orientated. It will genuinely make Death Guard armies a bit tougher against combat foes if they're -1 to hit whenever they get into combat. I think it means that Death Guard are going to be quite good as a bit of a counter melee faction now. In any case, besides new contagions though, let's talk through 6 of the most improved units, and why they might be in a good place after the data slate. First up, and maybe the unit in the army that most needed a boost, were the Plague Marines, previously 20 points per 5 of them, now just 80 points per 5 or 110 for 7. That's a great big 20% points drop there, and I feel like it probably does enough to get them from being to a bad unit into genuinely quite a strong choice, particularly combined with the new contagion boosts. At 80 points it does get them to the place where they're durable, being cheap toughness 5 wounds on the board, even if there are still going to be some damage 2 weapons that go through them quite quickly. I feel like part of the thing that perhaps kept their points cost relatively high before was just the sheer amount of special weapons and upgrades they get. Generally Death Guard Plague Marine squads can run really quite heavy in war gear, maybe a champion with a heavy plague weapon and plasma gun, perhaps 2 more heavy plague weapons per 5, and then some combination of blight launcher, special weapon and plague spear, maybe or maybe not replacing one of those heavy plague weapons for one. Overall I think they're now just generally looking solid. Defense that's now good enough to get there, and damage output that's reasonably scary both at range and in melee. And I feel like they are a unit that kind of needed to get good, given that so many of the Death Guard characters are the Virion characters that need to be in Plague Marine units, and you can't really use them elsewhere. A few of those have got significantly better as well, as we'll talk about. Perhaps one of the other really enormous winners from the update as well though were the Deathshroud Terminators. They were 145 points before, and one of Death Guard's strongest units, dropping down to just 125 points for 3, so just very slightly north of 40 points per Terminator now, kind of similar to plenty of the other Terminators in the game. And despite having a very slow movement of 4 inches, they have some massive advantages, a huge toughness 6 and -1 to wound when characters are in the units, which they usually will want to be, given that the Terminator support characters are pretty much all very efficient. Then chip in with some anti-infantry shooting with those Plague Spurt gauntlets, before the main event for a whole load of lethal hits Man Reaper attacks at strength 8, AP 2 and damage 2. Hitting on a 2 and with lethal hits, they are just incredibly general purpose, will go through elite infantry and really punch up against big vehicles with a few lethals thrown in. I still expect these to be the backbone of the Plague forces, particularly with one of the debuffs from the contagions of Nurgle, and remain an absolutely great choice to deliver via rapid ingress with their supporting character. Next up, I feel like the Foetid Bloat drone was perhaps one of the more slightly mediocre units from the previous index. 135 points I just didn't think was that exciting for this defensive profile and the amount of damage it can do, but they've seen one of the biggest percentage points cuts out of anything in the index, dropping down all the way to 100 points, a huge 26% decrease. I think for that price tag they're now very, very usable, fairly tanky for the cost, perhaps not exceptionally so, but that 5+ invulnerable save definitely helps. But they can move a bit faster than most Death Guard units at 10 inches, so should be some of the ones to deliver those new contagions where they need to be. And then have the choice between 3 fairly usable wargear options with the Blight Launchers, Plague Spitters, or Flesh Mowers. Out of the 3, I'd probably be most tempted by the Plague Spitters at the moment. 2d6 Strength 6 and AP 1 auto hits within 12 inches that ignore cover are great, never mind the fact they've got anti-infantry 2+, and just an absolutely devastating overwatch threat against some armies that they just absolutely can't ignore and can't tolerate on units that wanted to move on to objectives. The Flesh Mower also seems usable too. That'd be a bit more threatening against Space Marines. Overall looks really quite exciting. I'd be tempted by a couple of these to move up and throw contagions into range, plus threaten some very big overwatch. Moving on, Mortarion himself gets a reasonably generous decrease. He was 370 points before, and now he's 325. A nice rotten core to have at the heart of the Death Guard army. I don't think that it was enormously standout compared with most 40k things before. His durability I would have rated at okay, but his damage output just not very exciting for this sort of level character, and buffs helpful but not standout for 370. At 325 though, it feels far more playable, with toughness 12, a 2+ save, 4+ invulnerable and 5+ feel no pain. That really is pretty exceptionally durable for that kind of points cost. Only around about 80 points more than a Space Marine Land Raider now, and getting invulnerable saves and a feel no pain for that is pretty exceptional. I think for this sort of level character, he's still more durable than he is dangerous, but he's still going to be able to put down most medium-sized enemy units with, say, around about 10 wounds on average to a 3+ save vehicle. He can deal with 1 wound infantry quite well as well, between Rot Wind and his Silent Sweep mode. Finally, he can give you some benefits of cover and stop enemy units from debuffing Death Guard units with -1 to hit or anything, both of which are pretty helpful. And overall, I feel like if you liked him before, you'll still like him now, though perhaps relative to a few of the other units in the index, he didn't go down by as much of a percentage drop. Next up, for perhaps I feel like one of the most standout of the Virion for this points cost is the Tallyman. Only 45 points for this guy now, and particularly given the Plague Marine drop, he seems just super auto-include for a Death Guard army. I think he was already good before and still would have got played if he still remained 55 points. These guys are just all around good value for what they bring now. A +1 to hit for their own unit could be just good enough just in itself for a Plague Marine unit of 10 models perhaps. That is going to add quite a lot of damage both at range and in melee. But really I think the primary draw to taking him is the command point generation. If you roll 2d6 and get a 7 or more, then you gain a CP. That's around about a 58% chance, so usually you can expect around about 3 CP over the course of a whole game from him, if you can keep him alive and on the board outside of transports. Between those two boosts, you probably could have him cost significantly more than that, and then he also does add his own small stat line as well. Here's just another Plague Marine body to add to the unit, but gets 4 wounds, and helps the unit shooting a little bit with a fairly dangerous plasma pistol with sustained hits D3. So in my opinion probably remains the single best of the support characters, though that's not to say that the other ones are very good. The Foul Blightspawn still remains pretty excellent with his fights first. Finally, for the focal units before we talk through the rest, I thought I'd also mention Typhus and Poxwalkers as well, one fairly commonly run combo in the old index. Typhus Lord of the Zombies just being an annoying distraction threat, with a big squad of Poxwalkers rolling up the board while Typhus belts out some mortal wounds and puts the smack down in combat. For the points changes, Typhus has seen a good decrease, 100 points from 115, and Poxwalkers are down to 100 points from 120, making them a far better durable chaff unit. I think for 100 points now, Typhus is just fairly enormously good value. He's got a very tanky profile as you'd expect for a Death Guard Terminator Lord, 6 wounds at toughness 6 with the 2+4+ saves. Very powerful melee, similar to a Lord of Contagion but with +1 strength. Strength 9 and damage 3 with lethal hits does give him at least a small chance to punch up against tougher stuff. He gives his unit a -1 to hit in combat, and gives leadership 6 to Poxwalkers, who are leadership 8 normally, so that's quite good for hordes of chaff with a bunch of objective control points en masse. I think his best thing though is the Eater Plague. In your shooting phase, select a unit within 18 inches, and most of the time they're going to be suffering d6 mortal wounds, really quite good for something that you can just throw at the enemy and go off the vast majority of the time. Even when you do backfire it, it's not going to be too bad if it's just killing a few Poxwalkers. Talking of which though, Poxwalkers dropping down from 60 points to 50 is rather nice. That's very good for just Death Guard chaff units that you might want hanging around to do primaries or secondaries. 5 points per model with toughness 4 and a 5+ feel no pain is very good durability for that cost, and that's usually what you want your chaff units to be able to do. They're not generally going to have particularly good damage output, but will stack maybe a few saves at least with their lethal hits that they get, and they can potentially turn some enemies into zombies, and Typhus can heal the unit as well with his Eater Plague if he does happen to kill some enemy infantry or something with it. Overall, just between the points cuts, I feel like Typhus for 100 points, leading a squad of 20 Poxwalkers for another 100 points, just gives your opponent a really quite irritating and tanky horde unit to deal with a big sting in the tail with mortal wounds and melee. Otherwise, I feel like the changes to the other infantry units perhaps aren't quite as exciting. Blight Lord Terminators are down to 165 and remain the cheapest Terminators in the game, and not bad when they get toughness 6 as well, I suppose. Though I feel like ultimately they were outcompeted by Deathshroud before, and they still will be now, perhaps to an even greater extent. But if you want a big Terminator block to support with stratagems and characters and things, then you can get more of them than Deathshroud, I suppose. Cultist chaff has dropped a little bit to 50 points, though is nowhere near as durable as Poxwalkers. They do have some advantages though. Spawn's down to 70 points and still a bit on the pricey side, I think. I can't see many people choosing to take them when you could get Plague Marines for just 10 points more. Otherwise, for the Death Guard motor pool, the Blight Haulers got helped a bit. They're down to 100, the same as the Bloat drones. Doesn't maybe seem like quite as big a drop as they got, but I feel like they remain a usable anti-elite infantry sort of units with mid-strength but high damage weapons. Plague Burst Crawlers got a small points cut down to 165, which I think is kind of fine really. They were one of the strongest units in the index, and I think that they still will be very interesting with the Lord of Virulence as well. A whole stats bunch of ignores line of sight firepower is fine, plus either some entropy cannons or plague spitters. Rhinos are a bit cheaper, which is good news for the Plague Marines. They seem like they'd be very usable to still get the Plague Marines where they need to be, up onto the midfield objectives. And the new cheaper Hellbrute is just 140 points. Again, that one might be kind of interesting with the Contagions now. Previously, when Contagions was just -1 toughness and basically nothing else, it wasn't quite as exciting. But maybe having one Hellbrute in a list could be a pretty reasonable idea now, if you might be further debuffing the units that it hits with an extra worse save, or being -1 to hit next turn. Its damage and defense still aren't really very exciting, but that wouldn't be the main reason to take it. Otherwise, Land Raiders are down to 240, the Predator Destructor to 130, and the Defiler to 190. Finally, for the main index, besides one from bonus entry, Games Workshop really did go quite extensive on the character unit drops, giving fairly meaty points cuts to just about everything. I think absolutely standout will still be the Terminator characters, which were generally considered to be pretty strong on their own right before, never mind before Deathshroud went down to 125. The Lord of Contagion wasn't awful for the buffs that he gave, and now he's down to just 80 points. For the 4 rerolls that he gives a unit, and allowing them to fish for lethal hits if you need to, that is pretty excellent, and he's very dangerous in melee with his damage 3 himself. The Lord of Virulence for 100 points is still excellent between his main profile and coordinating the firepower of Plague Burst Mortars. The Terminator Sorcerer can give you -1 damage and has some fairly potent firepower, and the Terminator Lord dropped a bit too. Otherwise, most of the Virion characters dropped, bar the Plague Surgeon for some reason. Both the Foul Blight Spawn and the Biologous Putrefier I think were perhaps some of the more interesting ones. Wouldn't be too surprised to see those leading Plague Marines into battle. And otherwise, the standard Lords, the Malignant Plague Caster, and the Demon Prince and the Winged Prince both went down as well. Out of those, perhaps I feel like the standard Lord might be one of the most interesting still. He still adds a fair bit of fighting power to a Plague Marine squad, and for just 65 points for his stats, that isn't too bad. Maybe not the worst overall between his rerolls and his own stat line, which definitely is a lot more fighty than most of the Virion. Overall, loads of improved units, though I thought it would be worth just talking about the one bonus drop from the Demon's Index. 35-point Nurglings, I think, is another boon to the Death Guard as well. These little guys running around in squads of 3 that can both deep strike or infiltrate as you choose per game, I think are generally going to add strength to the army, and just help you coordinate winning the objective game while the rest of your army does the main work of holding those objectives and fighting off the foe. With a fairly tiny unit footprint and deep strike, they can get into the corners of the board or the enemy deployment zone quite often to be able to do those secondaries. Potentially in the right game you could go for some big plays and try and move block the enemy turn 1. They're very sacrificial indeed at just 35 points, though 12 wounds with a 6+ invulnerable save isn't too bad durability wise, and your opponent might need a little bit more firepower than they really expect, and they even give a -1 hit debuff nearby. Seems like they're still capable of spreading their own little mini contagion as they go. I'd definitely be tempted to include a couple of swarms of these if you are partial to some allied demons. Overall, broadly, I think that things are looking fairly up for the Death Guard given the update. They've definitely had some slightly more generous helping out than some of the other lower tier factions in Warhammer 40k, and I think it's good that they added in the bonus contagion rule as well as just giving points cuts. I think that was needed. I definitely expect to see a lot of Deathshroud Terminators. Typhus and Poxwalkers still seems incredibly fun, and I feel like we'll see a lot more Plague Marines on the board as well, backed up by some of their efficient supporting characters, maybe the Foul Blight Spawn or the Tallyman being some of the most popular. Let me know your thoughts though, and which units that you're most tempted to play going forward. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well. That's what allows me to keep on making videos like this quite so regularly, so if you are enjoying a lot, any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.